I'll start out the reading, and if you will, read the italics, the words in italics. Those who, let me say that these are words by Frederick Douglass. They're very appropriate for the sermon today, or talk today. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground.
They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters.
This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle.
Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.
Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them.
The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress.
So it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Harris today. He is a professor at Sam Houston. He was born in Hattiesburg, native in Hattiesburg. He's been an active participant in local civil rights and champion for social justice. Apparently he started very young with the civil rights movement. His mother was secretary of the Hattiesburg NAACP, so that would put him at about 16, I guess, something like that. And he has many honors as a speaker, a lecturer, a writer, and I think I'll just shut up and let him take over from here.
I hate standing behind the microphone, but I will do that today. First of all, good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me. Robin invited me, and I understand he's not here today, right? Was that who you were saying?
Yes.
They're traveling?
Yes, he's on the road.
He was on the road. He was there at Ollie, and thanks to Paula Mathis for inviting me. Paula was a student of mine years ago. We won't say how long ago that was. When I was a professor at Southern Mississippi. I have to say that I am very impressed with your congregation. I'm very impressed with your church. When I was invited to come speak to a progressive church in Ellisville, Mississippi, I thought that's an oxymoron. Progressive in Jones County, Laurel, close to Laurel, Mississippi, because we all know the history of Laurel, Mississippi and the history of Jones County. I remember some very infamous residents of Laurel, Sam Bowers, Deborah Snicks, Cecil Sessom. Those were white Klansmen who drove down to Hattiesburg, Forest County, to kill Vernon Damer back in the 60s. But what I want to do this morning is share with you some stories. And in a shameless plug, I'm going to tell you that some of the stories I'm going to share are found in my book here. And some of them, I don't have time to go into all of them, of course, but the name of the book is Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. Grammatically, it is very incorrect, okay? But that's the name of a freedom song that we used to sing in Hattiesburg during the Civil Rights Movement at what we call mass meetings. Again, those stories come from here, and you mentioned my mother. My mother was a warrior. She was a foot soldier. She was an icon in the Civil Rights Movement in Hattiesburg. She passed away about 5 years ago. And whenever I have an opportunity to speak, I have to invoke her presence and her spirit wherever I am, because to say she was a warrior really doesn't quite describe what she was. She was unafraid. She was unbowed. She was always there to provide whatever needed to be done to make the movement go forward. So I invoke her presence, I invoke her memory, I invoke her spirit, because without her, literally and figuratively, I would not be here today. Because she instilled in her three boys this notion that freedom ain't free, God don't like ugly, and that you have to step up to the plate when your name is called to provide leadership. But I want to start with some stories And I'm going to ask you for a little audience participation, very silent audience participation. I want you to think about the time, that moment, that epiphany, that light bulb came on in your head where you realized that racially you were different from other people. Raise your hand if when you remember. And I want you to just think about that and let it marinate for a moment. Let it just sink in when you realize that, hey, I'm white. You're not. And what did that make you feel like? Not how it makes you feel now, but if you can remember what you felt like back then. I want to share with you some stories about when that revelation came to me, when that realization came to me that not only was I different, but because I was different, I was going to be treated differently. My grandfather, who I call Daddy, he was a man I adored. I worshiped this man. And he and I had a special bond. And one of my favorite things to do with him was to walk from his house downtown Hattiesburg to pay bills, to do shopping, whatever he wanted to do. That was just our time to do that, our time together. And we walked, as I said, and as closer we got to downtown Hattiesburg, his countenance changed, his whole demeanor changed, because he knew he was leaving the safety and comfort of his community and his home and going into a place where there could be trouble, downtown Hattiesburg. So as we got to a sidewalk, and we saw a white person approaching us on the sidewalk, we could be at a crosswalk or an intersection or entryway into a store. Daddy would, his huge hands, he would grip my small, tiny hands. He would bend down to ear level, and he would whisper to me, "Aunt, you know what we have to do now." And I knew because we had played this role so many times. You can imagine what we had to do when this person approached us on the sidewalk, right? You can't imagine that. What we had to do was step off the sidewalk and let that person pass. It didn't matter how much room there was on the sidewalk. We had to step off the sidewalk and we had to bow our heads. We had to lower our heads. We had to avoid eye contact with that person. And my granddad wore this Panama hat with this colorful cloth band around it. I will always remember he would tip his hat as he bowed his head in what I now regard as an extra show of deference to these individuals who had really diminished his manhood, his humanness, and because we had to do that. And it really didn't matter, as I said, how much room there was, because the laws of Jim Crowism at that time was we were subservient to the white people in town. Our role was to play the role of the servant, to play the role of the less than. And by the time I got home, we had bowed to white people probably 15, 20 times. And that was the basis and the foundation of Jim Crowism, the evil of it. Because it inculcated young people like myself. I was young. I was probably maybe 7, 8, 9 years old. But it was being instilled in me at a young age that you are different, and because you're different, you're going to be treated differently. Now, I knew my granddad, as I look back on it now, I think he really felt awful that he had to subjugate himself in that way. He had to play that role. But I also know that he knew that in order to protect us, because had we not bowed our heads and avoided eye contact, we would have been regarded as uppity inward. And my grandfather knew what happened to black people who were regarded as uppity. So in order to protect his grandson and to protect himself, we played the role. We capitulated and said, we will be subservient. But it hurt him. I know it hurt him because he was a man. He had to bow before people younger than he was, out of disrespect for him for one reason and one reason only, and that was the color of his skin. I often say in Hattiesburg and throughout Mississippi, we did not have a democracy. We had what I call a pigmentocracy. Now, if you try to Google that, Google's not going to recognize pigmentocracy. What that means is that your skin pigmentation determined your status in society. And being black, our skin pigmentation relegated us to the lower levels. But it didn't take walking downtown Hattiesburg with my granddad to get the message that I was different. My mother and dad used to take my brothers and I to get soft serve ice cream. I love the soft serve ice cream on this cake cone. Y'all know what that's like, right? I mean, it's just really, really delicious. And there was this ice cream parlor on the corner of 7th Street and Bowie Street. And they had two lines, two windows, one for coloreds and one for whites. And we had to endure and had to play the role of being colored. And it didn't matter how many people were in the quote colored line or how many people were in the white line. For example, if there were 10 people deep in the quote colored line and there were no people in the white line, what might a manager or a person in charge say to the group? What do you think? Would you move over to the line? No, we couldn't do that because that was the white window and this was the colored window. And had we had the audacity to move over there, whether invited or not, that would have that would have elevated rather our status to being equal to those people who were supposed to stand in this line. Again, I was being inculcated those messages into my head about you're less than, you're not worthy, and because you're different, you will be treated differently. Now I want to fast forward to another period. This was about 1965. Actually, it was in 1964. It was January of 1964. That was an event called Freedom Day, January 22nd, 1964. And this was a nationally inspired event where the National Council of Churches sent ministers, rabbis, to Hattiesburg and throughout the South to help black people get registered to vote. And it was a massive, massive effort on the part of the church and the local community to get black people registered to vote. Well, one of the things that was going on was that when these people came down from the north, these ministers and clergy people, they engaged in demonstrations and marches along with the local black community. And the anti-civil rights forces said, here's how we will put an end to this fledgling civil rights movement. We will put all of these adults in jail for publicly demonstrating. And that's what they did. They did mass incarcerations of these individuals. Now the pro-civil rights forces said, if you're going to incarcerate these adults, we're going to put children in these demonstrations and picket lines. We dare you to treat those children where you treated those adults. And we knew how they treated the adults. And some of you remember those images of the police dogs and the water hoses and the billy clubs. And their message to them, we dare you to treat these children that way. Well, the anti-civil rights forces, including my city of Hattiesburg, in response to that, they passed a city ordinance that said that no one under the age of 18 could be on a picket line or a demonstration. That was the law that passed. So there's this chess game going on, move, counter move, and so forth. Well, in defiance of that law, my older brother James, my friend Horatio, and we showed up at the Forest County Courthouse this cold, wet January morning. We had picket signs around our necks. The signs read, "Let my people vote." They were very strong messages, but they were not provocative in any kind of way. So as we were marching, not obstructing traffic, anyway, we're just marching up and down the Main Street side of the courthouse on the sidewalk. All of a sudden, these police officers were cruising and they spotted us. They did a U-turn, making this loud noise with their tires and pulled up to the curb. They got out of the car, ran over to where the three of us were, tore the signs off our necks, threw us in the back of the police car. Now, there was a gentleman out there who was supervising all of this by the name of Lawrence Diot. He was with an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. he came over to the rear window of this police car. He knelt down and he tried to reassure us. He said, boys, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. Well, I wasn't feeling okay. And I knew it was not up to Mr. Guion as to whether or not we would be okay. It was up to these two gentlemen in the front seat of this vehicle that would determine whether we were going to be okay. And that became even more clear as we drove away from the courthouse. The officer in the passenger seat picks up his two-way radio. His exact words were, headquarters, have the dogs been fed today? They haven't. Well, we're bringing in fresh meat for them. And I know what kind of dogs they're talking about. They get us to the police station, and we're shivering from the cold and from the fear. I'm walking down the hallway, this long corridor, and there's only one thing on my mind. And you can guess what that is, right? I'm listening for the sound of barking dogs. I want to know where the dogs are. Where are they coming from? So if they start to attack me, I need to know where to go to safety. They placed us in this interrogation room. And there were chairs in the room, but we were not allowed to sit in any of those chairs. Instead, we had to sit on this cold, wet cement floor with our backs pressed up against this cold, wet cement wall. And we just sat and we sat. And one of the officers kept, the term I use, he tried to terrorize us, and he was very successful at terrorizing three boys. I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And he pulled out of his back pocket a weapon called a blackjack. And if you don't know what a blackjack is, it's a small piece of lead about this long, wrapped in black leather, that officers use to subdue people they're trying to arrest. So he was tossing this blackjack in his hand in a very menacing, threatening way, moving toward us. And he said, boys, you know what we do with this, don't you? And we do. But I'm not going to give you his exact words, because we're in God's house. He said, this is what we use to beat black people's rear ends with it. He didn't say black people, he didn't say rear end. And I thought to myself, my God, we managed to not get eaten by these dogs, but this man's going to beat us to death in this room. And about that time, the door of this interrogation room opens up with this loud bang, bam! In walks this petite black woman yelling and screaming, let these boys go right now. I said, let them go right now. You have no right to hold them. Let them go. That was my mother. That was my mom. That was Daisy Harris. I had never been happy to see my mother as I was at that time, because this was scary, folks. And she was motivated by two things. And keep in mind, she didn't knock on the door. She didn't ask, may I come in? She didn't plead and say, would you please let these boys go? She just opened up that door. And she was motivated by two things. One, she knew that an injustice was taking place. This was not right. And that was her motivation much of her life, because she was a dedicated Christian woman who believed in her faith, very much so. She knew this was not right. The second thing that motivated her was two of her babies were in there. You know what happens when a parent feels that their babies are being threatened? Particularly mothers. You know your child is being threatened, there's no limit to what you will do. Right? Can somebody say amen? Amen. Okay. And that was my mother. She just came in and she reminded me so much of the Good Samaritan and the priest. You know, when the Levite was going by and he was beaten, and people didn't want to help him because they were concerned about what would happen to them, not what would happen to this man. My mother basically said, do what you need to do to me. The rest of you do what you need to do, but let these boys go. So people ask, well, what did the police do? I said, these police did the same thing we kids did when she raised her boys. You better do what she says. My mother was small in stature, but boy, she had some lungs on her, and when she got through talking and giving them a verbal lashing, I guess they figured we better leave this crazy woman alone and let these kids go with her. So they did let us go. Fast forward, I'm going to share one more story because I want to leave some time for some questions and answers and some discussion with you. In 1966, well, go back to 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said separate but equal in our public schools is unconstitutional, and that we had to desegregate the public schools. Well, in 1966, 12 years later, I was one of 5 black children to desegregate Tim's Junior High School in Hattiesburg. Never before had black kids and white kids had gone to school together, but in 1966, that happened at Tim's Junior High School. There was Algery Clark, Elisa Clark, Benton Dwight, James Hicks, and myself. And it was a challenging time for us because, again, the white kids had never been around us. And for the most part, we had never been around white students before. We had been warned by adults to expect almost anything. I was called the N-word every single day I was at school. In a way, I became desensitized to it because I heard it so often. The word didn't sting as much as it did when I first heard it, but I had to put up with that because I was there to get an education. Some of my teachers didn't think I was good enough, that I was smart enough to compete with my classmates. We were told to expect all kinds of treatment, bad treatment. Being called the N-word, having low expectations for us in terms of our academic skills. But here's one thing that happened to me that I did not expect. Nobody could prepare me for this. I was walking down the hallway one day, and one of my white classmates by the name of Danny Kelly. As I passed Danny in the hallway, he hauled off and spat on me. He was aiming for my face, but this little man did on my pant leg. Now I want you to think, what would you have done had that been you who was spat on? What would you have done? Anybody?
I would have been in a fight.
You've been in a fight.
Yeah.
I asked young people today about that, and that's what they tell me. They said, oh, we get along. I just go upside his head. I was just knock him out. I was just brawling. Let me tell you what Anthony did. Because Danny's buddies were standing around jeering and taunting, daring me to retaliate. They wanted to see a fight. These are junior high kids, and junior high kids can be pretty cruel to begin with. But when you layer race on top of it, it gets to be really ugly. Every step what I did, I went to the bathroom, got a paper towel, wiped off my pant leg, and went on to my next class. And some people say, well, why didn't you retaliate? Why didn't you hit somebody? I said, every step I made to that bathroom, I had to fight that urge to go back and just hit him. Because that's insulting. That's just ugly, to spit on somebody. And I just wiped my pant leg off and went on to my next class. I knew that if I had gone back and hit Danny, here's what would have happened. I would have been expelled and sent back to all black Lily Vernon Junior High School. The biggest would have figured out, here's how you can make this an all-white school again. Provoke them into a fight. Harris is gone, we have 4 more left. Before the end of the week, we can be an all-white school again. That was their mentality. So I have to stop and think about what would happen if I did this. And the second thing, and the more important one that kept me from retaliating was something that Dr. King instilled in us. A strong message that is as powerful today as it was back then. Here's what he said. He said, if we continue this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth retaliation, we're going to end up being a blind, toothless society. And I said, yes. You knock my eye out, I knock yours out. You knock my teeth out, I knock yours out. What are we left with? We can do better than that. So I had to avoid succumbing to that urge to go back in and punch. My heart said, go get him. My heart said, let him have it. But my head had to tell me, no, this is a trick. This is a way to get this to be an all-white school again. How much time do I have? I have so many more stories I can tell you.
Let's say about 20 minutes if you would like.
How long?
Wait, 20 minutes if you would like. don't you, I think?
Again, the details are here. Okay. That was another story. And this came on April 5th, 1968. I was still at this all-white junior high school. The significance of April 5th is that it was a day after April 4th, 1968. And the significance of April 4th is that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee at 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, April 4th, 1968. I had to go back to school the next day. Went to my homeroom class, Ms. Whistler's class. And my white classmates were celebrating the death of Dr. King. They were saying, "Hey, Wick, nice shot. Chuck, how'd you get from Memphis so quick? The King is dead." And they were just this roar of laughter. And they knew I was there. They knew I was sitting there. Again, they were trying to provoke me. I realized that. But I had to just tune some of that stuff out, because had I reacted from here, I may have done something. I may have said something. And they were trying to get me to say something or do something. But as I sat there, I remembered about 2 weeks prior, Dr. King came to my hometown of Hattiesburg. He was scheduled to be at Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church at 6:30. The place was packed. All the pews were filled. The balcony was filled. They brought out chairs to put in the aisle. They were all filled because we had this once-in-a-lifetime chance to see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. come and speak in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. 6:30, he was not there. 7 o'clock, he had not arrived. 7:30, he had not arrived. And we began to have this fear that maybe something has happened to Dr. King, because guess where he was before he was scheduled to come to Hattiesburg? He was in Laurel. He was in Laurel, Mississippi, en route somewhere, and we knew there were people in Laurel, some members of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, that would just be a trophy for them to do something harmful to Dr. King. So we began to wonder if something happened to him. Well, about midnight, Dr. King shows up. And that church was as packed at midnight as it was at 6:30. Not a person had left. And this was a night for the next day. We had school the next day, and the adults had work the next day, but nobody wanted to leave. And I just remember watching this man. He was dressed in an olive green suit. And his oration, his speaking, his preaching, I mean, it just penetrated my head and my heart to hear this man, not just what he was saying, but how he was saying. Nobody can deliver a sermon or a speech like Dr. King. But that was one of those moments that I was thinking as these kids were sitting there saying these other things about him. And I found some solace in the fact that I did have a chance to see Dr. King. I did have a chance to hear Dr. King before his life was taken. Well, Miss Whistler, the homeroom teacher, she comes in, and I say to myself, well, thank goodness somebody's going to put an end to this madness and make these kids shut up. Here's an adult who's going to be more sensible than these teenagers. But I was wrong. Ms. Whistler said, "Okay, boys and girls, you're being too loud. Keep the noise down." That was her only response to these epithets and words that were being spouted at me. So that was part of my experience there at Tim's Junior High. I went on to desegregate the high school, which was called Blair High School, or Hattiesburg High School at the time. And that was an experience as well. One of my teachers gave us an assignment to write an original poem. And this teacher didn't think black kids could be as smart as white kids. And I did the assignment. I wrote a poem. The title of it was KKK. And I think that engendered a little bit of discomfort with her, KKK, but it wasn't Ku Klux Klan, it was Kennedy, King, Kennedy, in memory of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. So I got up and read my poem, which I had put lots of work into. And immediately after reading it, she said, "You didn't write that." she used a term I didn't know what it meant at the time, plagiarized. You copied this from somebody else. And the message to me was, you're not supposed to be smart enough to write something this nice, this good. But I had to. And I don't know if I ever convinced her, but that was okay. I knew I had written it, and I knew it was a good poem. Let me fast forward on to graduating from high school. I graduated from an all-black high school in Hattiesburg, Rowan High School, because the desegregation plan for Hattiesburg, as it was for many cities across the South, was called freedom of choice. That meant black kids and white kids could choose whichever school they wanted to attend. Black kids were choosing to attend white schools, but white kids were not choosing to go to black schools. So that racial balance plan wasn't working. So my senior year of high school, they drew a line in the house and said, everybody who lives on this side of the line would go to Rowan High School, everybody on the other side of the line would go to Blair High School or Hattiesburg High School. So I ended up graduating from the all-black Rowan High School, which was a great experience for me, because from the 8th grade through the 11th grade, I had gone to school with white kids. And my senior year, I had gone to school with all black kids. And culturally, I had to make some adjustments to get to that. But I went on to University of Southern Mississippi there in Hattiesburg in the fall of 1971. And my original major was political science, because I wanted to become a lawyer, come back to my hometown, and fight for social justice. That was my aim, that was my commitment, my calling, if you will. As I sat in these political science classes, I loved talking politics, but I found these classes not to be very stimulating intellectually. So I got bored with it. And I went to my major advisor and I said, Dr. Dumas, I want to change my major. He said, to what? I said, Spanish. And the only reason I chose Spanish is I took one Spanish course in high school, made an A in it, decided that should be my major. Okay, makes sense to me. But his response to me was, Harris, I advise you not to major in Spanish because, as you know, black people have something wrong with their tongues to keep them from pronouncing Spanish words correctly. Those were his words. And he said it with such authority and with such, like he was an expert in how black people speak. Okay. And I said, Dr. Dumas, if I ever had any doubt about changing my major, you just remove that doubt. Because there are black Puerto Ricans, black Cubans, black Mexicans, who have no trouble at all speaking Spanish. So I changed my major to Spanish. And I used to be pretty fluent in Spanish, and the key words there, used to. I used to speak Russian, I used to speak Italian, I used to speak Portuguese and Swahili and Spanish. Those were my 5 languages. And I always wanted to go back to Dr. Dumas and just sit down and have a conversation with him in Spanish. Well, and I'm sure he didn't understand any of it, but I just wanted to show him that as a black person, I did learn to speak Spanish. Well, moving forward, I graduated from USM in 1974. In August of 74 is when I had just come back from studying abroad. I was in Bogota, Colombia for about 2 months, living with a Colombian family, learning to speak Spanish again. I was walking across campus one day and I saw this young lady. She was a freshman, first semester there. And I said, I'm gonna marry her. That's gonna be my wife. She didn't know it. So I finally worked up the nerves to have a conversation with her. And we went on a few dates. And after a while, I just said, I want to marry you. And her response was, get a job first and then come back and ask me. And I thought, well, your parents really thought you well, So I went on and got my master's degree in counseling at Southern Miss. And set up in 76, and then I went to her again and said, will you marry me? And she said, yes. In order to get a marriage license, though, we had to go to the Forest County Courthouse to get that license. And this is the same courthouse where I was arrested as a kid. They go to the circuit clerk's office. Some of you may remember that circuit clerk is by the name of Theron Lynn. He was this huge guy. He was infamous for thwarting efforts by black people to register to vote. He was very proud of that image that he possessed. So we go up to the circuit clerk's office, and in order to get a marriage license, we had to register our intent to be married. In order to register your intent, you had to sign a book. And there were 2 books lying on the counter. 1977. This is Hattiesburg, not Johannesburg. This is 1977, not 1957. And this is not the Republic of South Africa, this is the United States of America. There are 2 books lying there, colored and white. Yes. And we had to swallow our pride and go over and sign the colored book. And I jokingly, and I embellished this a little bit, I'll just be honest with you. I was probably trained with 200 shades of red. I was angry, I was mad. I said, this is not right. And Svenita, who's sitting here, my then fiance, said, honey, you know, you have a right to be upset. You and many others fought to get rid of this stuff. You have every right to be upset. But I love you, I want to get married. Let's just be colored and sign the darn book. So we were colored for that brief period because we wanted to get married. And we left there and went out to Texas in 1979, and that's where I was for most of the time. I did come back to Southern Mississippi in 1999, worked for 3 years at Southern Miss under President Fleming. But let me just stop there. I said, I'd love to engage in some conversations and questions from you if you have some. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, what do you see the future of America with the current rise in the strength of white supremacy movement in America?
Good question. There's recognition of the fact that there's a rise in white supremacy and white nationalism in our country. And I think the current occupant of the White House has spurred that, has spurred it on, has created the climate in our country where the white nationalism is being fed. And it also reminds us that we have to remain vigilant. We have to be involved. We can't afford the luxury of ignoring it or becoming desensitized to it or saying, well, that's just a new normal. We're going to have to speak up and speak out, write letters, and most importantly, go to the ballot box. But here's the thing that worries me, though. Even when the current occupant of the White House leaves, either through impeachment or is voted out or serves a second term, the people who support him are still going to be here. Yeah. They will still have their MAGA hats, and they will still go to these rallies, they will still have these beliefs about brown people and black people and gay people and anybody else that he doesn't like. That's what scares me. But I think the rise of white nationalism is scary. I mean, I went through the civil rights movement and we saw what white supremacy and white nationalism were like back then. I think a reoccurrence of that is something, and I have to believe that at the end of the day, the country will do the right thing. I just can't imagine that this country will allow this to continue. That's the optimist in me, but the realist in me says that I never thought that the guy would get elected to begin with. I was wrong about that. Yes, sir. Other questions? Comments? Yes?
How did your mother find her voice, her strong voice?
She found it in her faith, her religious faith. She learned to play the piano at age 15 or 16 and became the church pianist at Starlight Missionary Baptist Church. And she just had something instilled in her about, God doesn't like ugly. That we have a job to do or an obligation to fight discrimination and to fight injustice, to resist evil. She took that to heart. And she came along at the right time because she was not beholden to anybody. I mean, she had a high school education, but she mainly worked as a domestic. She worked as a maid in some homes of some Jewish families in Hattiesburg, who were somewhat sympathetic to the movement, but not actively involved in it, but they were sympathetic to what was going on. So she was able to be out front and take a stand, go to meetings, and do all those things without any fear of losing her job. Now, my father, on the other hand, he worked for a company at the time it was called Hercules Powder Company in Hattiesburg. Some of you may remember Hercules. It was the largest employer of black people in Hattiesburg. And if you got into trouble, if you did or said something that management didn't like, they could fire you. And he took the position that he was not going to get involved directly in the movement. But his main reason for not being involved in the movement, I think, was this. He said, I'm not going to go on a picket line, I'm not going to be in a demonstration. Because if anybody can or clan or cop hits somebody in my family, I'm not turning the other cheek. And he meant it. So the message to him was, let's find a different way for you to support the movement. And we don't need people out there who will retaliate in such a manner. But my mom was, she was something else. She was just an amazing woman, and we miss her greatly. I think about her all the time. She's my inspiration, and not only the time when she rescued us from that jail, but all the other times when she didn't just talk about what you should do, she actually did it. And she made all kinds of sacrifices within the family. Back in 1964, something called Freedom Summer occurred. And that was when white and black college students from the North, actors and entertainers, came to Mississippi. And she and my dad opened up our home to white students. And if you were not identified as being a participant in the civil rights movement, if you had any of these individuals in your home, you were immediately identified as somebody who was sympathetic to the movement. But that's a long answer to a short question.
There must have been some interesting conversations with your grandfather and your mother.
Yes, very much so. In fact, as my granddad ended up losing his home through foreclosure. And he and my grandmother came to live with my mom and my brothers and me. We had 3 bedrooms, and there were 6 people, I think, in the house with 1 bathroom. And my granddad was dying of kidney failure. And as he was in our home, he was lying on his deathbed. He called my mom into his bedroom, and I was there to listen to what he had to say. And his words to her was, Daisy, I want you to get out of that mess. And we knew what he was talking about. That mess was the civil rights movement, because he was afraid something was going to happen to her. He was afraid she was going to get hurt. And he did that as a father protecting his daughter. I want you to get out of that mess. And tears were flowing down my mom's face, and she said, okay, Daddy, I'll get out of that mess. But she was also knowing she was not going to get out of the mess. But she needed to say that for his sake, for his benefit, because he needed that comfort in knowing that his daughter was heeding his advice. And that was a very moving moment where she realized that, I think God will forgive me for not telling my dad the truth this time. Yes, sir. Somebody? Yes, sir, go ahead.
What year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated in 1971.
And Mississippi Southern turned into a university yet?
Yes, it was University of Southern Mississippi at that time. William D. McCain was the president still at that time.
Did you go right into the university?
I did. I graduated in May from high school in 1971, and fall of 1971 is when I started.
How could you possibly afford to go into university at that time?
Well, it's interesting because some people thought I should go to Jackson State or Alcorn or Mississippi Valley State, and I said, no, I shouldn't have to do that. There's a university right in my hometown. Why should I go so far away? But here's how I went. This is a little bit of a history lesson I give my students about the involvement of higher education in our country. In 1958, the Russians did something that had never been done before. They sent Sputnik into outer space. And in response to that, the Congress passed what was called the National Defense Education Act. And it provided funds for people to go to college, get degrees that would help us keep pace with the Russians in the space race, right? So I went to school on a loan program called the National Defense Student Loan, NDSL, 3% interest. Now, we were on the quarter system at USM at the time, and it cost me $159 a quarter to go to school. We didn't have to purchase books. Our books were loaned to us. Everybody. I don't know if you've ever been, Paul, I don't know if you remember this, you go to the Coliseum and you would get your class card, and the card was perforated. One half of the card was your entrance to class, the other one was you went to the bottom or the basement of Mississippi Hall where the bookstore was, and you presented that card and they gave you the books for your class. So it was relatively inexpensive. I didn't have to live on campus. I rode the city bus to campus. It cost a dime to ride the bus. I think I had to buy a coupon when I got downtown to go the rest of the distance to. So it was not expensive at all. But I was determined to go. My older brother had gone, but he didn't like it. He went for a year, then he went into the military. And then most people in my family and my teachers and all, they knew I was going to go to college. It's just not where I want to major in. And I just felt I was blessed enough to have that kind of support that I decided to go.
So that was part of the space program. Having coincidentally, at the time you left high school, was a grand coincidence, right?
I think it was, or maybe it was providential. I don't know. It was part of the plan. But by the time I was a freshman at USM,
Yeah.
they had the NDSL, National Defense. Again, 3% interest. And I was there for only 3 years. I started in 1971. I graduated in 1974. I started when I was 17 years old, and I finished when I was 20 years old. And it wasn't because I was such a rapid pace or anything. We were in the quarter calendar when I started, and about my sophomore year, the university switched over to the semester calendar. When they converted my quarter hours into semester hours, I had nearly enough to graduate.
Maybe one more quick question, Dr.
Yes, ma'am.
Harris?
What do you say to people who prefer to remain apathetic for social issues, whether it's speaking out against racism, homophobia, xenophobia, because they believe, they shouldn't say anything because it doesn't affect them?
Good question. I think it's such a wrong way to think of things. There's a saying, they came for the Jews and I was not a Jew. They came for the workers, I was not a worker. Then they came for me and there was nobody left. So I think we have to think collectively that we're all in this together. And, we may have all come over here on different boats, but we're all in the same boat now, right?
Yeah, you're right.
This boat's going to rise and we're all going to benefit from it. But if it sinks, guess what? Everybody perishes. But those people who, for whatever reason, don't want to vote, don't want to speak out, they think all this, the hatred, the bigotry, the xenophobia, the homophobia, all those things don't affect them, therefore they shouldn't care about them. They probably have somebody in their family who is gay. They probably have somebody in their family who has experienced some religious bigotry. And I think change comes along when we know that when there's somebody we are close to, we know is affected by these isms and these phobias. That's when change comes about. But I know we have to keep at it. We have to be vigilant. Back in the Civil Rights days, we used to sing a song called "We Shall Overcome." That was the last song that we sang at a mass meeting. And I always tell people the key word in that song is "shall." Future tense. We're not there yet. It's not, we getting ready to overcome, we have overcome, or as we say in Hansburg here, we've been overcome. No.
We were actually, we were planning to sing that, but I'm gonna skip that today
Okay, that's fine.
because we wanted to hear you speak.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very impressed with your congregation. I'm very impressed with your movement. I think any organization that stands for the treatment of human beings in a just way, regardless of the skin color, regardless of their income, regardless of any of those external kinds of things. I have to applaud you. I have to call you partners in the struggle. I hope you will regard me as a partner in the struggle because we all go into the same place. We may not be in the same congregation, but I think what motivates us and what sustains us is our belief in something bigger than ourselves. And that's what keeps me going.
Well, there are those people that say that you didn't only free yourself, your own race, but you freed a lot of white people from their
Absolutely.
prejudices also.
Absolutely, that's a very good point, because there were white people who had these prejudices and stereotypes of black people, and once they got to know us, they liberated themselves. They quit thinking because the way they were taught, because they, oh, that person is smart. But I resisted some of those stereotypes because I don't have rhythm. I don't like chitlins. You said, yeah, we need watermelon. Okay, thank y'all very much.
But I do understand you right very well. Do you have some copies of your book that we might purchase? And do you think it would be a good Christmas present for friends?
Yes,
family?
absolutely.
I can attest to that.
Yes.
You plug the book, Paula.
What do you think, Paula?
I'll just tell you, on the front cover here, there are 3 people.
On the front cover, there are 3 people. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. On the front cover, there are 3 people. If you look at the picture, you will recognize one of them as me. This is in 1964 at Freedom School. There's a white gentleman here, and then there's my friend Ratio, as I told you, who was in the police car with me. And this white guy is teaching us to play the guitar. At least he's trying to teach us to play the guitar. He was doing his best, but we were not very good students, I guess. We didn't learn to play. I wonder if anybody could identify, if I pass this book around, who the white gentleman is. He was, the song that you played at the beginning, he inspired those people.
Who's that? That is it. So you got a free copy of my book.
Pete Seeger, that's him. He was in Hattiesburg.
How old is he? How old is he?
Pete Seeger was probably in his 60s maybe at that time, or 50s or 60s. And I was, this was 64, so I was like 11 or 12 years old at the time. And Pete was one of those people who came down to help with Freedom Schools, and I was a participant in Freedom Schools, and he was there to teach us music and guitar lessons and so forth. As I said, Pete tried his best to teach us, but I never learned to play the guitar, but he did a good job. So yes, I want to make sure you get a copy of this because you got the right answer.
Okay. Well, we want you to stay. I'm sure there are people that would like to speak, if you have time.
I'd be happy to.
Okay. But we will conclude our service. We will conclude our service.
What, could I say just one more thing? I'm
Yes.
sorry. Tomorrow in Hattiesburg at Main Street Books, there's a book signing, and I will be there with about 15, 16 other authors from Mississippi signing books. They'll be selling books. I have many copies of this book in the trunk of my car right now, so if you want to buy one now or come to the book signing, I'll be happy to work with you.
Thank you, Paul.
Let us extinguish our chalice and do that.